Yeah, that would be good to like use with anxiety. Thank you. All right, let's do this. Do you think you need things? It's not that many.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, you're welcome to use it. I don't think. Andrew, do you feel strongly about it?
Oh, yeah, because people might not be able to pick it up on the live stream.
Oh, I forgot about that. Okay.
That's still with us. That's still with us.
Yeah.
Okay. I feel a little funny using this microphone because I really don't need it, but I'm going to, for the benefit of you folks watching on the live stream, you many folks watching on the live stream. Welcome everyone to Van Alen Institute. This is the first time that we've done a live event like this in our space since, the before times. So we're very excited to have everyone here. We moved here 1 week before the pandemic started, and a week after Mayor de Blasio said, "Oh, Joanna, come in," said, go home. And so we've been back here since September, and it's a delight. I'm just going to take a moment to tell, probably most of you already know about Van Alen. We're 127 years old. We started as a society for Beaux-Arts architects. And the idea of our founders back in 1894 was that Beaux-Arts architecture, which then really only mostly existed in Europe, was the style that was appropriate for the ambitions of the new nation. And so that's how we started out. So over time, our focus expanded and evolved, and notably in 1995, we went from being the Society for Beaux-Arts Architects to the Van Alen Institute Projects in Public Architecture. And it was at that time that our mission extended beyond design education to actually asking designers and architects and other supporters of and people within the Van Alen family to reimagine what the role of public spaces could be in the life of people living in New York City and beyond. So in 2020, we evolved again, and we our board of directors voted in a new mission, and that mission is to help create equitable cities through inclusive design. When we say equitable cities in the context of Van Alen's work, what we mean is cities where communities drive how their public realm is designed, constructed, and managed. And by inclusive, we mean all of you, and the expertise, the breadth of expertise in your lives and in your professions that you bring to this work, and also especially the expertise of people who live in the communities where we work. So in short, we're designing with, not for. So look around. Every person in this room shares the vision of an anti-racist, just built environment. We know that. And perhaps there's no greater injustice in the way that the built environment comes into being than an environment that leads to people having poor health. So we're delighted to host this conversation tonight. It celebrates the publication of Restorative Cities, Urban Design for Mental Health and Wellbeing by Jenny Rowe and Layla McCay. Jenny is here with us, you'll hear from her in a moment. And it's illustrated by Spring Bracha Beck. Spring's also here tonight. This important, timely book presents a framework for firmly situating mental health, wellness, and quality of life at the center of city planning and urban design. If we didn't know that before, we sure do now. And many of us did know that before. So we're honored to have with us one of the book's authors tonight, Jenny Rowe. I want to mention also we have our esteemed colleagues, Joanna Frank and Daphne Lundi. You'll hear from them in a moment. Unfortunately, our friend and Van Alen board member, Sarah Williams Goldhagen, could not join us tonight. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of our panelists, and then we'll go right to it. Jenny Rowe is professor and director of the Center for Design and Health in the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, an environmental psychologist and former head of landscape architecture for an international architectural practice. She's written extensively on the impact of the environment on health and well-being, including for the World Health Organization and The Lancet. Joanna Frank is founding president and CEO of the Center for Active Design. I want you to know that if I held this up, you could probably practice it yourself. I'm just going to say that. The Center for Active Design advances design and development practices to foster healthy and engaged communities. Prior to launching the center, in 2013, Joanna worked for the City of New York during the Bloomsbury administration, where her positions included Director of Active Design and Director of the New York City Fresh program. And finally, Daphne Lundi is Deputy Director for Social Resiliency at the New York City's Mayor Office of Resiliency. She creates programs that strengthen and prepare New York City communities against climate change impacts. She's also a member of Black Space, a collective of Black urbanists that work to bridge the gaps between policy, people, and place to address inequality and injustice in the built environment. And actually, I should mention that Van Alen is currently working with Dark Matter University, which is a part of Black Space. So with that, I want to just say thank you to our panelists. Really very excited. I've been reading into the book, and it's quite extraordinary and timely. And just really appreciate your doing the launch here. So with that, I want to introduce Van Alen's Director of Programs, who will be leading the conversation this evening, Andrew Brown.
Thanks, Deborah. Just really quickly before we kick things off, I'll just walk everybody through the program. So Jenny's going to give a presentation, 10 minutes with an introduction to the book. Then we'll follow up with a panel discussion for about 30 minutes. We'll have a quick Q&A for about 10 minutes or so. Folks can just raise their hands and close quarters, so we'll be able to hear each other on both sides. And then afterward, we'll stick around for about 20 minutes or so where people can continue to nibble on food and wine, cheese, and grapes. Chat, bond, share, and then also if you brought a copy of the book, you can get it signed by Jenny. Yeah. So quick housekeeping stuff before we really jump into it. If you didn't see already, the bathrooms are back toward the door. There are 2 of them. And again, we're gonna have some time for a little reception afterwards, but I think we want to be out of here by about 8:30. Is that right? So just keep that time in the back of your minds. But yeah, with that, I think I'll hand it over to Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Andrew, and thank you to you all for coming tonight. It's cold and it's dark, but I really appreciate you coming out. So I'm Jenny Rowe. My notes are a lot smaller than Deborah's, so I'm going to put my glasses on if that's okay. We're having a very timely conversation. The pandemic has focused our attention on the physical environment, how it affects us both physically, mentally, and socially. So this is a very timely moment to be having this conversation. A few people just to acknowledge, first of all, my co-author, Layla McCay, unfortunately cannot be here. She's in the UK. Layla is a public health policy specialist. She directs policy for NHS Confederation. She's also a former psychiatrist. We've approached the book from slightly different angles. I'm a researcher and psychologist, generating what I hope is robust science, showing the relationship between urban design and health, and Layla is coming at this from a very applied and policy focus. So a good combination, I think. Also a call out for Spring. Spring, can you just stand up so everybody knows who you are? Who was our wonderful illustrator who worked so brilliantly to translate our ideas and our thumbnail principles into the illustrations I'm going to show you tonight. Also to thank the Van Alen for hosting this, and also to thank the Dean's Department of the School of Architecture at UVA who funded the illustrations and are also sponsoring this event this evening. All right, so Just before we dive in to some of the principles in the book, I think it's important we're all on the same page as to what and how we define mental health. We go into this in quite some depth in the book, but for tonight, I'm just going to quote the World Health Organization definition. Mental health is a state where a person realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. So people with mental health issues usually experience some combination of problems with their thoughts, their emotions, their behaviors, and relationships with other people. These symptoms cause distress, impair their personal functioning, and affect the extent to which people are able to meet this definition of health. And there's a spectrum of mental health issues, from depression, anxiety, stress, things that most of us may experience, hopefully not on a day-to-day basis, but certainly during COVID, we'll have experienced those types of emotions, through to more severe mental health disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, dementia, schizophrenia, psychosis. So the book addresses this spectrum in terms of mental health. So Layla and I came together to write the book because we firmly believe that whilst people with mental disorders, mental health issues need medication and therapy, and they need to have good access to good mental health care, we really believe in a wider public health approach that includes a role for the built environment. So here's our framework with 7 pillars that relate to how we might embed the design of our cities for mental health. 2 points I want to make about the book. The first is it's evidence-based. It builds off scientific evidence and thousands of studies in restorative environment research, drawing from psychiatry, geography, architecture, design, planning, public health, etc., etc. And we've brought that evidence together to show how certain settings can foster recovery from mental fatigue, depression, stress, and anxiety, and some of those more severe disorders I've just spoken about. Now, some of these concepts are quite well understood, like the green city, the blue city, the active city, and the inclusive city. Others are less well understood and less well evidenced: the neighborly city, the playable city, and the sensory city. The second important point about the book is it's evolved from a really strong theoretical framework in restorative environment research. I am a restorative environment researcher that's embedded in the discipline of environmental psychology, which has evolved over the last 50 years or so. Now, there are 4 characteristics of restorative environments, 4 psychological processes. Again, the evidence is backed up by thousands of studies. Stephen and Rachel Kaplan came up with these 4 attributes of fascination, which is our engagement with the world we interact with, our wonder and curiosity in that world. A restorative environment has a good sense of compatibility, a good fit with your needs. That makes sense. A sense of being away, a sense of escape from our everyday, and a sense of extent, looking up and out of the horizon and out of your context. I think there are other categories that we might add to this framework. I talk about these with my colleagues, including Sarah, who sadly isn't with us tonight. But the idea of being with, I think, has really evolved since the pandemic, and also particularly for people who live on their own and our older, aging community. It wasn't in the original framework. And the idea of awe, this sense of vastness, our connection with another world, is linked with extent. It doesn't need to be in the form of national parks, or it can be generated from just looking very closely at nature, the fractal of a leaf pattern, for instance. So I, with others, are really kind of keen to expand this framework, but that's the framework on which the book is built. The Green City. I'm not going to say much about the Green City because it is so well evidenced. There's a huge amount of research now to show the benefit of being in and living near to green spaces. What I am going to talk about, though, just for a minute, is the equity issue. We have all appreciated, I'm sure, access to green spaces during COVID, the relief that has brought in terms of stress and anxiety. But the poorest people in our urban communities have the poorest access to green space, and they also have the poorest quality access. So COVID has really shed light on those inequalities. Here you can see two different scales. So Spring we worked together to develop principles at the kind of neighborhood scale, which is the scale you see here. And then in the next slide, if you go to the very far right diagram there, we also worked at a larger city scale on these thumbnail principles that emerge from the evidence. The book has a framework that is kind of replicated through each chapter. And first of all, each chapter sets out the mechanisms by which a restorative attribute delivers its benefits over here. Those might be personal, individual drivers. People respond differently to restorative environments depending upon their age, their race, their culture, etc. Then we move on in the book to actually spell out the evidence. So the second image here brings together the evidence in relation to a specific theme in the chapter. And then you have these thumbnail principles. A point I didn't make earlier, but it's really, really important, is the book is designed not as a rule book. These are not rules that we expect to be followed. They are principles generated from the evidence, which we hope people will interpret flexibly and creatively. And it's quite exciting to both Layla and I that some people are actually beginning to do this, which is great news. Okay, the Blue City, reasonably well evidenced, less so than the Green City. I know here in New York you've had a lot of unwanted water recently, but what the evidence shows us is that water, or access to water, can be perhaps the most restorative attribute of any city. How we manage it, though, is obviously critical in terms of climate mitigation, managing sea level rise. Techniques like sustainable urban drainage systems, which also work hand in hand with green space, do help provide these restorative niches in our city. So we need to be flexible and adaptive about how we're using water in a city. The sensory city, less well evidenced. Again, the book brings us together. When we talk about the sensory city, we're talking about really appeal to our full sensory system and not just our visual system. So some of the ideas in the book here include for reducing unpleasant noise. Noise has a very detrimental effect on our mental health, on our cognition, on our sleep. So designing positive soundscapes, sonic refuges, increasing opportunities for access to, let's say, positive auras. These smells, particular smells, perhaps of a coffee or a barrister truck, harness feelings of place identity and belongingness. And visual complexity in the environment is one of the key factors in how restorative environments work. The image there you see is an interactive lighting design for a bridge in Londonderry in Northern Ireland. It's a bridge associated with a very, very high rate of suicide. Now, the light on that bridge in this design can be manipulated using your smartphone. And what Layla and I have posited here is that it's increasing cognitive engagement, causing a kind of aesthetic distraction, and it is significantly reducing suicide from that bridge. All right, so we're on to the neighbourly city. So we need cities that build strong social networks, foster supportive social relationships. We know there's a relationship between those and a lower risk of developing mental health problems. And I think the idea of the neighbourly city is going to be increasingly important as we manage migration, which is predicted to increase owing to climate change. We're going to have people moving out of neighbourhoods. We're going to have people receiving people into their neighbourhoods. And so how do we design and work and build social systems that can support that change and that flux and flow? And some of the ideas here you'll see, again, are generating from the evidence. The active city, again, the relationship between walkable cities, cities in which people can cycle, and their physical health, the reduced risk to, say, cancer, to cardiovascular disease, is really pretty well documented. What we are doing in the book is showing the relationship between physical activity and mental and social and cognitive well-being, and really advocating for whole health, active living strategies. Some of these benefits include particularly improved brain health and memory functioning in older people, and also in fostering healthy child development. We have here an image of Barcelona, a superblock model showing many of the characteristics of the active city. It's a mixed use community. It's a mixed income community. They have multimodal streets, so what you might call comfortable streets, a high sense of street connectivity, integrated public transit, street trees, urban greening, etc., etc. All right, the playable city. The benefits to play are fairly well documented in relation to child well-being. But what we're arguing in the book is for an all-age approach to play. Our desire for play, curiosity, wonder does not just cease when we hit our teens. And playable environments offer continued opportunities for mental health in adolescents and adults. And in the book, we distinguish between two main types or characteristics of play. Pure play contexts, props and contexts designed specifically for play, such as playgrounds, play streets, the image here of the netting. And other playable contexts, not designed for play necessarily, but in which playful activities can take place. Interactive art exhibits, opportunities for play appropriation, parkour, and such like. And finally, the last theme, and I would say the most important in the book, is the idea of the inclusive and diverse city. So we interpret inclusive inclusive design as design for all ages, all genders, all races and ethnicities, all sexual orientations, all socioeconomic strata, and for the full diversity of physical, sensory, and cognitive abilities and needs. Unfortunately, we also know that urban design has contributed to segregation, exclusion, prejudice in our cities, which affects people's self-esteem, dignity, independence, and mental health, as well as their ability to access the full range of a city's educational, economic, social, cultural, and health opportunities. And I do think this notion of social equity and the need to address that is one pathway to which we might achieve this vision for improving mental health in our cities. Onto how you might get the book. So Bloomsbury declined to come and sell books this evening, citing COVID as their reason. Everybody has different levels of comfort in relation to COVID, so I think that has to be accepted. There are discounts available on the book. Please pick up a flyer on the way out, which will give you a 35% discount. And we're going to move on to a discussion now. I guess I'll just posit one question before we move into discussion. What I'm really interested in as a researcher now is, yes, we need more research. There are many gaps in the book, but really I'm interested in how we shape urban design to generate a transformation in mental health, and one that I think we all agree needs to happen. So thank you. I'll pass this to Andrew.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think I'm going to take this chair and we're going to move over.
You're a guest. You don't. Yeah. This one. invite the panelists to join us.
Cool, and thanks again. Whoa, that's loud. Thanks again, Jenny, for that great introduction into the book, and introduction to the principles of the framework, and some of the interventions that define the healthy city, or the restorative city, rather. I thought a fun way to start this, and it's definitely in line with like your closing question about like how do we actually make these ideas happen, is to present the first question actually to the audience. So you've all got an introduction to this book and this framework and its ideas and like this vision of the restorative city. With a show of hands, is there anyone who just heard this who thinks that this is a terrible idea and shouldn't be enacted anywhere on either the neighborhood or the city scale? Is there anybody here who feels that way? Seeing no hands, I would assume that we're all in agreement that this is a great idea, right? So I think looking at that, how do we, to your point, right, actually move forward with these ideas, which, now that we've gone through a pandemic, people are much more conscious of their relationship to space and how it impacts them more than ever before, right? So I think there's actually a chance to build maybe political will from the ground up to do some of these things, right? So with that in mind, how do we move forward? And my first question is to you, Jenny. Don't look like that, isn't it? We're all friends. We're all friends. Yeah. Well, almost, but close. So the first question is, when I was reading the book, first of all, I really like the book. It's just so clear, right? And like these ideas are very well articulated and spelled out. But the vision to me, it seems kind of radical. Like it seems kind of big. Like currently cities do not center mental health in planning and design decisions, right? We don't do that. But in the introduction, you say that what makes this framework so great is that it's actually a quieter approach, right, to thinking about the future of cities, how we plan them, how they design, or how we design them. And I wanted you to speak a little bit to that. Like, why do you think it's better to take this quote unquote quieter approach to pursuing these ideas rather than like presenting some big, bold, futuristic vision articulated with flashy renderings, right? Or like big models, right? Like, why do you think this framework is a better tool?
Do I press mute here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have the green light?
I have a green light now. The word quiet, interesting. Would I use the word quiet now in this kind of quasi-COVID period? Possibly not. The book did go to peer review in, let's say, May of last year. But when I use the word quiet, what I'm really saying is the opposite of top-down, rigid, Haussmann-style master planning. I'm thinking of quiet in terms of the soul of a community, in terms of the needs of that community, and building what we call in urban planning bottom up, working with that community. I'm also thinking restorative niches, environments that promote mental health, do not need to be large in scale. I was in Central Park today, a wondrous experience, but our parks and small urban parks do not need to have scale. But the one word I would use and stress rather than quiet, I think, is connection. So we can have quiet, small spaces that are designed with a community. We can have pop-ups, we can have temporary urban initiatives, tactical urban initiatives that work from a grassroots level. But the critical thing, I think, for mental health is that they form connections and corridors and are linked so people can move from one to the other quite easily. And this has to be doable for communities where, say, there isn't the energy and the money to input large public parks. Large public parks take a lot of maintaining and upkeep. So I think when I'm saying quiet, I'm meaning small scale, connected, and working with the community.
Right, no, that's a great point, because then the interventions become greater than the sum of their individual parts, right? Is that the thinking?
I was thinking patchwork quilt, where things connect and are sewn together, maybe as an image.
Gotcha. That's great. And then my next question is for you, Joanna. this volume and the echo too makes it sound like this voice of God situation. And Joanne.
I don't have my glasses on, so I can't
Just
see.
all
Yeah.
the
I really, I can't see
Yeah. So the button on the
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, yeah. So my question for you, given your work at the Center for Active Design, is about when you looked at upgrading and updating the active design guidelines, right, to include social connection, social cohesion, mental health, right? That part of that process of doing that updating was talking to city agencies, right, experts across disciplines to get an idea of like what are the interventions, right? How do we make this happen in New York? And I know you've run this process for a long time. You've got collected a lot of ideas, talked to a lot of people. I was wondering, now that you've done all that, how are you putting that into action?
Sure. So when we started active design a decade ago, which is a little alarming, we really did think about like how do you ensure that this work doesn't just sit on a shelf and look pretty, and how does it actually change the city? And so what we did is that we embedded it into policy and made it mandatory for all New York City funded projects to use the active design guidelines. And so we did that by looking at contract process, by looking at all of the kind of the moments where decisions are made within a city infrastructure, and then really just and kind of forcing ourselves, I would say, into those processes, so that at every decision-making moment, you have to then consider the health consequences of the investment that you're making as a city. And then we even reached out into affordable housing, because although New York City's affordable housing is built by private developers, some city dollars actually usually go into those projects. So we said whenever a city dollar is used for a project, that active design needs to be considered. So we used all the existing mechanisms of the city and overlaid active design into that. And what was good about that is that it continues today, and we don't have to continue to kind of reinforce it or advocate for it, because it's just become part of the city processes. So when we update the active design guidelines, which we are doing right now, and we're really looking at holistic health, so all aspects of health, mental health, physical health, social health, with this equity and inclusion lens, because there's really no point having a fantastic Union Square if you don't have fantastic every other square in the city, right? I mean, it's kind of too easy to have a fantastic Union Square, quite frankly. And so as we update the active design guidelines, as long as we keep the name the same, then all of those other infrastructure, all of those other decision-making pieces around infrastructure and housing and so on, they will now need to use the new active design guidelines. So you have to play politics, right? You have to understand what are the mechanisms within the environment that you're working with, and how do you get involved in those mechanisms. So we work a lot with global investment companies, so with sovereign wealth funds and with pension plans and so on. And we look at how do you change the underwriting criteria that they are funding by, whether it's for private developers or for bond issuances. Because if you change the underwriting criteria where they then require that you are meeting health metrics, and when we look at health, we always look at mental health as well as physical and social health, then every developer or every city that wants to borrow money from said pension plan or sovereign wealth fund will have to meet those criteria. And that's how we've seen the momentum for market transformation really gain steam. And then, of course, COVID changed everything. And I don't think we needed to do that anymore, because now we have demand, which we didn't have before.
No, that's brilliant. So you map out the decision-making matrix and then graft on these priorities on top of it, right?
Yeah, without changing any of those processes, right? Because they take years, and legislation and voting and all of those messy processes. So yeah, I mean, you need willing elected officials,
Right.
which
So-
isn't nothing.
Yeah. So speaking of elected officials, bring in our city representative here to the conversation. So I have kind of two questions for you, but I'll ask my first one, which is from the city's perspective, how are you imagining the alignment between our healthy city goals and our climate resiliency goals? Because in the book, Jenny points out, I think like makes perfect sense, is that the restorative city is the resilient city, right? So I kind of wanted to get a sense from New York City government, how are you lining up those two goals?
Yeah.
I think in the work I do that's focused on social resiliency, so much of climate resilience is connected to public health. And what we see is that neighborhoods where we have these huge disparities when it comes to health are the same neighborhoods that are then impacted when there's an extreme weather event, whether it's a heat wave or a flooding event or what have you. And I think that a lot of the work we do is to help people see that connection between public health and resilience. I think oftentimes people go to the hard infrastructure when it comes to resilience. They go to building the protection or building the wall or building those types of structures. But what we find, and I think what was really beautifully outlined in the neighborly city section, is the power of social cohesion and sites of connectivity, and the huge role they play in terms of disaster recovery, of building connections, of sharing information. And I think the power of that type of work is that it's not only incredibly relevant during an extreme weather event, it's also just relevant for us to be better connected to each other, especially in the part of the book where you talk about loneliness. So much of loneliness is tied to people not having these networks, or people being isolated, or people not having places to sort of form communities. And so I think that and particularly thinking about social infrastructure, it's really seeing the role of social infrastructure, both from a climate resiliency lens of resilience hubs, or thinking of these places as cooling centers or what have you. But it's also thinking about those spaces as just being the critical infrastructure where neighborhood bonds and connectivity really starts to form.
That's an amazing point. And because you were talking a little bit about like the physical ways in which we connect people, but I think it's also like a psychological matter as well. Because I think another great point in the book is that all of the design moves don't really matter if people don't feel like they have access to them. Like the change that is like not prescribed but suggested in the book only really counts if people feel like those changes are for them, right?
That they have agency. It's on green now. That they have agency in making those decisions. I just wanted to put in the point for agency because it's super important to mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was wondering from all of your perspectives, maybe starting with you, Daphne, is that how do you go about that work of community involvement, community engagement, making sure that, again, like the decisions that are coming down, the changes that are happening, people see them, they feel like they have a place in it?
Yeah, so a lot of our team's work tends to be focused on extreme heat and preparing people when there's a heat wave. And what we found is that oftentimes the delivery of messages around climate preparedness are most effective when they're delivered by people in neighborhoods and by people that community members already trust. And so for us, for the past couple of years, we've had this Be a Buddy program where we've partnered with these existing community-based organizations that already have sort of the roots in the neighborhood. They already have these connections to community members. And through partnerships with the health department, we're able to, train up folks that are already on the ground to sort of know what to do when there's a heat wave, or sort of better understand the connections between, climate hazards and public health. And so I think for a lot of the work we do, it's oftentimes finding the right conduit or the right messenger for the types of information that we're trying to share. It's really thinking about this idea of trusted messengers and how we're able to sort of use these existing social networks and sort of built-in social cohesion pathways as a way of sharing information with people.
That's cool, and I see a similarity between like what you're sharing and what Joanne just talked about in terms of kind of mapping out the way either information gets shared on the ground in the neighborhood or the way decisions get made in city government. It's like you kind of have to understand how these players connect first before you start suggesting what change might come. Makes a lot of sense. Maybe to like zoom back up to the kind of a city leadership level, because I really want to ask you this provocative question right now. Because
Did anything happen? I don't understand. Is there any changes in city government?
Well, let me tell you, Daphne. 2 days ago, right, we just got a new mayor-elect, right, Eric Adams. And so I think it'd be great to hear all of your perspectives on this, because this is about like what kind of leadership do we need to push the changes we want to see at the highest levels, right? Because I think we've been talking about how do you get people engaged and connected on the ground. Joanne's really talking about, I think it's more about like bureaucracy, right?
Talking about the money.
The bureaucracy and the money, right. How the capital flows and how decisions get made. But then like, what kind of leadership do you need in City Hall, right? To kind of keep things going? Is it about like them using their bully pulpit to advocate for these ideas? Is it kind of rolling up their sleeves and getting in with the bureaucracy to kind of grease the wheels how they can? Is it all of the above? Like, how do you see them in their role? And I was thinking for you, Daphne, let's say Eric Adams shows up, right, one day in your office and he's like, Daphne, like what do I do? You know, like I'm mayor now. I've been waiting for this moment, right? What do you recommend? Like, what are the decisions I need to start making on day one?
Yeah, I have thoughts. So I think that oftentimes for newly elected officials, like the orientation is always towards what is the new thing that I could put my name on, that I can sort of label as the thing that I did. But I think so much of what this book speaks to, and so much of what we know in the role of in the world of social resilience, is the importance of investing and maintaining existing networks in neighborhoods. So again, I always go back to the libraries, the community centers, the rec centers. These are not spaces that I think are sometimes seen as sexy or innovative, but these are the sites of infrastructure that people rely on and people use all the time. I'm thinking about the past 2 years, almost 2 years that we've been in this pandemic. The libraries that were open, the community centers that were open, like those were really critical spaces. And I think that if we had elected officials going in and thinking about how we can invest in these existing sites, but then also do the work of investing in places where we have gaps in terms of infrastructure, in terms of buildings, green infrastructure, what have you, that would go a long way in sort of filling in these known and historic inequalities in terms of access that certain neighborhoods have to resources, or access that certain neighborhoods have when it comes to investment and maintenance. But that type of work is critical. And I think that part of what I oftentimes find as a challenge in the climate resiliency space is that our work is oftentimes siloed and not seen in the same realm as other types of programs or initiatives. And I think moving forward, we have to be thinking about climate resiliency as it relates to public health, or climate resiliency as it relates to things around youth development or mental health and all of these connections. And I think if politicians understand that connectivity, they then understand that, investing, in the local park that's existed for a long time is not just helping to address these long understood, discrepancies in investment and infrastructure. It's also addressing things like extreme heat and making sure that there are places of respite and cool corridors and all of these types of investments as well. It's also addressing things like air quality and the huge disparities we know exist in certain neighborhoods when it comes to air quality, and then the associated disparities in health. So I think that if politicians entering the administration want to do good, it's really trying, and especially because, again, these past 2 years, I think the place attachment that we've had has just grown and magnified. If they started at where people are and where people are gathering and where we know that the critical investment is needed, that is going to go a huge way in terms of these larger systemic changes around climate resilience, around public health, around discrepancies in housing, accessibility, all of that stuff.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, it's like stop chasing the ribbon cutting opportunities and really focus on the ground. And even if it's like supporting the community and making a small change, right? Like that's a meaningful act.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add too is that there's so much new work coming out around the concept of care. Justin Garrett Moore talks about the Department of Care all the time. I think there was an article in Bloomberg News today about care, but it's really speaking to this thing that is in some ways intangible, but you know it when it's not there. You know it when there's not being care expressed in terms of investment or how we're using our money. And I think that if more elected officials that are in places to make decisions about how we spend our dollars sort of use that lens of care and use that lens of restorative city, I think that will go a long way in terms of helping to just speak to all of the disparities that still exist across the city and just how the built environment is really experienced.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's also a place where the evidence matters, because if you can speak in a compelling way as to what these small acts and interventions are actually dialing up to, and like what it actually means for people living in a community, then it doesn't look insignificant compared to like cutting the ribbon on like a new subway station, let's say. Or
I mean, we still need new subway stations.
We still need new subway stations. Do that.
Yes,
Yes,
it's
and.
more of a
Yes,
yes
and.
and. Yes, agreed. Infrastructure, good. Social infrastructure, also good. Yeah.
And so for our other panelists, I'd like to extend that question to you. So how would you like to see leaders lead from your perspective?
Sure. Having worked for a previous mayor, I'll tell you what worked last time. Let's see what works this time. I think we all have to be savvy in understanding that politicians have an agenda, right? They have commitments that they've made, and we have to understand how what we're doing fits with their goals. So if it's all about job creation, then we will demonstrate how having a healthier population and equitable access to infrastructure leads to job creation or more hours of work or whatever productivity numbers they need to reach, right? So we have to be able to play the game to ensure that what we see as being such a priority is also kind of baked into kind of how they achieve success. So agency is a very good example that maintenance is directly related to agency. Agency is also related to economic outcomes, educational outcomes, health outcomes, etc. So we can tie all this stuff together because we have the evidence base and we have the knowledge and we have the passion. So really kind of showing that by investing in a community and its infrastructure and all of these kind of more smaller acts, how that then leads to economic success or job growth or health outcomes. I think with COVID, health has actually become an outcome in and of itself, which it wasn't before COVID. We were always having to make the business case for health. And we would always have to show that having a healthier population means higher productivity or, whatever, quality of life, and that would lead to, responding to demand and so on. Whereas now I think we can actually talk about health as an outcome in and of itself. I would also say we mostly work with the private sector these days. We haven't worked with New York City for the last, I'd say 8 years. So maybe that will change. Hopefully with the new active design guidelines, we actually won't be publishing it with the city until the new administration. So we're hoping for some momentum. But we work with the private real estate sector across the country and in 40 other countries. And I would say they have a huge part to play in bringing this about, because you know what? Guess who's building the majority of what you're seeing here? And it's private real estate. And so they are already motivated to do this because we can make a very strong case that this increases their return on investment. So if we can make an economic argument that this is in their best interest, and we show them, like, this is the evidence base, this is, these are the best practices. Now, certainly in a post-COVID world, there's no pushback. This has really changed. Folks are now coming to us, and they already were. We run Fitwell. So they were saying, like, tell us how to do this. We are interested in doing this. So that's a sea change. That's a completely different place than we were 10 years ago, where we were like, basically top down, this is a good idea. We see the evidence base. This is something that, is going to be great for everyone. And people were just kind of shrugging at us, like, no idea what you're talking about. I don't even believe you. So now, like, the demand is there. This is our moment, right? If we want to bring about this transformation, we have the demand right now in a way that we've never had before. So I'm very optimistic that we will see big changes because certainly the private real estate industry needs to be doing this in order to meet those other goals around their environmental, social, and governance commitments. So we see change happening from where we're sitting.
I'm really sorry, I don't know your new leader. But I'm really interested from the audience just to raise your hand. Do you think this is somebody who's going to endorse this sort of strategy? Do you think they have an interest in mental health? Raise your hand.
The first Viking mayor.
Yeah. So on this, okay. Any other positive reflections? So on to leadership. I think what's interesting in the US, let's say compared to the UK, is the role of your city mayors, who are extremely powerful, can really shift and change agendas. And I think we've seen that in relation to active living for sure. In some cities in the US, that is beginning to happen in the UK. So Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, is mapping access to green space. So mapping where the inequities are and targeting resources to those deprived areas, because it's always the deprived areas that lack green space and restorative space, targeting resources appropriately and committing to establishing a guideline of 400 meters or 500 meters to a green space for every home in London. I think that's quite a powerful mandate. So I would love to see our leaders get behind those types of mandates. I think they do need to come from evidence. So in my experience, let's say working with a chief medical officer for Scotland, they need scientific research. They commissioned us to do a cortisol study showing the relationship between our stress biomarkers, the cortisol in our bodies, and the relationship to green space. And from that research came changes in policy in health, recreational, and social policy. So as a researcher, I think that we need to inform our leaders and really leverage that research for change.
Were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. I think that's kind of adding to what I was just saying, that you really have to, we all have to do the legwork, right? We have to say that being in New York City, it's within a 10-minute walk to a park, which is actually a similar distance, of course, because we're looking at the same research, because everything we do is also based in research. So we've seen success with this, but you really have to show, like, if you have a population that is within 10 minutes walk, a 10-minute walk to a park, or 400 meters, whatever it is, to a park, why that is in the interest of both the individuals living in that community and the city as a whole. And I do think that it's really important that they are pieces of information that are easily digested, right? Because we have 5,600 peer-reviewed research studies behind what we do. We need to boil it down into a couple of really tangible pieces for folks to be able to repeat, right? It's our job to translate that research. These politicians are not researchers. I'm not a researcher, actually. It's really, I feel like it's what you've done so beautifully with this book, right? It's really something that's applicable, that it's tangible, people can get hold of it, but it feels like, oh, this is substantial, right? This isn't just someone winging it.
I couldn't agree more with you, Joanna, and also Daphne. I forgot to mention something earlier, and it's cost-benefit analysis. So it's showing for every tree what the dollar value is in return to, let's say, mental or physical health costs. So yeah.
I mean, I'm always quoting the fact that depression or depressive symptoms are the #1 cause of disability in the world. So they account for more loss of work than any other health issue. And that was pre-COVID. God knows what it looks like now, because all of our mental health has taken a beating during COVID because of social isolation and anxiety and all of those other things. There's a lot of studies about the increase in issues around mental health. So there was already a massive economic impact around mental health. People don't know these stats, though. I mean, I on a daily basis, Jessica's here as well from CFAD, we have conversations with people like, oh, if only we knew what to do. We want to promote health. We understand we need to do that because of COVID, but I guess we're just going to have to figure out what's going to work. And it's no, there is 100 years of public health research that has already done all of the research that you could possibly imagine. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, guys. You just need to do it.
I couldn't agree more, and I think you are absolutely right. It's our responsibility to get those messages out. So I had a delightful conversation with Maurice Cox, who is the chief planner for Chicago, and pointed out to him, because Chicago are investing, I think, in 75,000 trees on their streets. And I pointed out to Maurice Cox there's a relationship between the tree canopy and prescription rates for depression. And his eyes popped out of his head. He did not know the statistics. So how we get these messages to our leaders who have got limited amount of time to absorb the messages is something that we all need to work on, I think.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into my next question. So this question is really about storytelling. Like we're talking about how do we get the message to electeds, but how do you get the message to everybody in the post-truth era, quote unquote? Because we're talking a lot about evidence, facts, and stats, and they all matter, and they certainly resonate with certain decision-making audiences, right? But we've seen in the response to COVID and COVID precautions around the country, like some of the changes that we're talking about to relate to health, space, particularly shared space, it gets so politicized so quickly that the numbers and the stats and the evidence don't matter anymore, right? It's all about like, who do I trust? Who's telling me what, right? So I was kind of wondering from your perspectives, one, do you think about that? And then two, if you do, what do you think could be useful tools in kind of penetrating that kind of like culture war cloak that can kind of stop these evidence-based approaches in their tracks? And I kind of want to throw this at Daphne first, because I know that Daphne's a huge fan of sci-fi. So you're a lover of fiction, of stories, right? Do you ever think about, like, in your work when you're going to talk to a community, you know, about resilience, or if a change has come to the neighborhood, is there like any tool that you think like, oh, if I just had a video to like show people this, or like if I had a certain pamphlet designed a certain way, like this would be really useful? Do you think about the work that way? And if you do, you know, what comes to mind is something that would be helpful?
That's a big one. I mean, I think about it from the perspective of knowing what to say or what is most relevant to the audience that I'm with. And so I think that, like, from a practical level, if I'm talking to somebody that is, you know, a homeowner versus if I'm talking to somebody that is a renter versus if I'm talking to somebody who's an elder versus somebody that's young, I think it's always imperative on us to make sure that we're presenting information and issues that are most relevant to their perspective, where they are, and what they need. So I think that that's also the approach that you know, both Jenny and Joanna are speaking to in terms of how do we craft information and policies and make them relevant to the politicians that we're talking to. Because I think for all of these cases, we oftentimes don't have a lot of time. And so it's really about, like, why do I need to care about this? Like, why do I, Daphne and Flatbush, like, need to care about this proposal? Or why do I, Daphne and Canarsie, need to care about this proposal? And I think if even in that exercise of knowing the people and being grounded in or trying to be grounded in like what their perspective might be, it then helps us understand the storytelling or the work that might be involved to sort of go for them to go on this journey with us. And not to say that it's always going to be successful, but I'm always surprised at how sometimes in certain spaces people like lead with the wonk, the policy wonk. Like, policies are incredibly important. Like, we should be wonky about them to make sure that they work. But that type of language is not going to be relevant, timely, or impactful to somebody that's not in that space. And again, we could be communicating the same information, but it's one thing to say it in like the lens of how one might write like a policy memo or a brief or a white paper. And it's another thing to sort of figure out how to say it to somebody that, again, is just like a person in the world trying to figure out like what these changes or what these rules might mean for them and their everyday life. And I mean, I think in terms of how we convince or help people understand sort of a lot of these moves, I think sometimes it's trying to find space for people to see it so they can believe it. Because I think, you know, if you're talking to somebody, I'm particularly thinking about the examples around the Green City. You know, there might be many reasons why somebody doesn't want to invest in more trees or invest in new parks. But if you have somebody walk down a neighborhood or walk down a corridor where there are no trees, or they sort of move from neighborhood to neighborhood, I think that they feel that difference, or they notice that difference. And so if we can make spaces for almost like almost for embodiment in a way, to kind of help them see how these types of moves might fit into their world, I think that gets at sort of getting people on board in a way where like they can sort of feel it or see it for themselves, versus having to, you know, climb that huge hurdle of convincing somebody that may not be on board for some of these moves. And again, it's not always possible, but I think it goes a long way if we're able to show how these types of things might impact somebody on that sort of embodied sensory level.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. We actually, after the active design guidelines, the next thing we did was come up with a new set of guidelines called Assembly, which was looking at civic life and how do you design a community so that people are more engaged in their civic process, so that they are more likely to be stewards of their own realm, of their own public realm. There wasn't a lot of research in like kind of what the connection is between your physical environment and these trust, participation, stewardship. And so we actually did a lot of original research to kind of look at this. And it was fascinating because it was exactly what you're talking about, like why, like that feeling of a place that is for me or is not for me. There are design cues that really telegraph about whether this is a place for you or not. And so we did a lot of research about that. I think it's really interesting that your built environment itself is actually telling you, you know, many of the things that you kind of feel, like your levels of trust are definitely affected by the level of maintenance of the streets in the neighborhood that you live in. And if you don't have high levels of trust, you're not going to interact with one another. If you don't interact with one another, you're going to be more socially isolated, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really interesting, as someone who deals with the built environment more than kind of public policy, that there are ways that you can really take the built environment in order to help to overcome some of those issues of trust and participation in public life and so on. And it's this kind of cyclical, and agency, actually. We found one of the strongest connections between agency was actually the maintenance of the neighborhood that you live in. So high levels of trash are associated with low levels of trust in each other, trust in the police. Also low levels of agency, that you don't feel like you have that kind of power to determine your own future. And so something as simple as like garbage pickup and having the right size garbage cans is having all of these other issues that you're not going to be able to have a constructive conversation with a community if they don't trust you. So you really have to understand like kind of the historical context, what are the underlying issues within a neighborhood that may be leading to that kind of breakdown of trust. I can't deal with fake news. I don't even know where to go with it. As an organization that is research-based, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that.
I think that's a really meaningful point, though, is that trust is built by the small moves. Because it kind of goes back to what Daphne was saying earlier, like, you know, there are big things that need to be done, but I think if a city government has become estranged from a neighborhood, the way to reestablish those bonds is maybe not one big marquee project, right, but really start paying attention to the smaller things, the things that people, when they walk around the neighborhood that they live in, they see these, you know, cracked sidewalks, right? A lack of street trees, and they just feel like nobody cares. That the people who make these decisions, I have the authority to shape this place, don't care about me. And so when it comes time to talk about, like, you know, let's open a new community center, right? Like, people don't show up to those conversations because they're just so used to feeling like, again, nobody cares, right?
Right. Well, the city isn't dealing with what they really care about, and then they're coming in and like, we're going to build a nice new shiny community center, and they're like, yeah, but we actually don't have a crosswalk that works outside the school, or, you know, whatever is going on that actually matters to the community. So I think, so actually the new set of active design guidelines, which Daphne has worked on, has a whole new chapter about community engagement and the best practices based on research for community engagement, which was not part of the original active design guidelines. So there were only 2 chapters of the original active design guidelines, building and urban design. And there's now a 3rd chapter about community engagement, because I think the 10 years has really shown us that this kind of top-down approach isn't successful long-term. So you really need to kind of use the same approach and kind of careful view of the research and how to work with a community in order to create communities that are of the community and not imposed by us saying like, oh, you know, these are a nice set of strategies that I think will work for you.
That's a great point. I want to get a quick time check.
It's 10.
10 of? Oh, wow. All right. Well, I guess I want to see if, Jenny, do you have anything on that point that you want to chime in on before
I'd
we
like
open
to
it up
hear
to the
from the
audience?
audience because I'm really keen how this is resonating with you and your thoughts.
All right, let's do it. Let's go.
Hi, my name's Ricardo. I'm a student at NYU, and I wanted to ask this question to Joanna, actually, who had mentioned that a lot of your work comes in trying to convince, like, you know, private developers because they are the ones who are bringing a lot of the majority of this development where we need to consider a lot of these changes into fruition. A lot of your work comes in convincing them how these things are actually in their benefit in the long term in terms of like cost return and, you know, just the overall satisfaction with the development and stuff. Are there aspects of active design or just sustainable development that you feel like don't always are more difficult to convince and that are like, you know, a good investment in the short term that may not yield like, you know, a direct return monetarily, but might be best interest for the community? What kind of issues might those be, and how would you still try and convey those in a way where you can, you know, have them carried out?
Sure. I mean, I would say that the greatest challenge we have with the real estate developers we work with, which is all of them, is actually around affordable housing because it's not a market rate industry. So then how do you demonstrate to a real estate developer, and they are typically private companies, right? And they're for-profit companies, so it's their fiduciary duty to maximize profit. How do you demonstrate when it's not a market rate sector that investing more in a project where the benefits are going to be reaped by the residents, like it's actually difficult to then demonstrate how that directly correlates with a return on investment increase for them. So what we did in the case of affordable housing was, again, like look at the mechanism. So who is actually benefiting from having a healthier population within that particular sector? So the government, well, we're not equipped to deal with the government, so we're not going to go there. But we actually ended up going to Fannie Mae because Fannie is doing a lot of the underwriting of affordable housing deals. And so Fannie really cares about the stability of residents within affordable housing projects. So then how do you work with Fannie in order to provide the real estate developers with some of that financial benefit that they are reaping from having a healthier population within the housing that they're investing in? So Fannie actually came up with a 15 basis point discount for affordable housing developers who are using Fitwell, which is the certification that we run. And so that way you're moving the money from the people who are benefiting from it, which is the underwriter, right? The kind of the mortgage provider, in this case, Fannie Mae, and you're giving it to the developer so that now there's a financial incentive for them to have a healthier population where you can't make a direct financial correlation. And then the way that we do it with private real estate developers who are in market rate sectors, so every other sector basically than affordable housing, is that we run Fitwell, which is a certification where you have to have an amount, you have to have a total score. So you can't just opt out of the ones that you don't directly like. So we can make a correlation between an overall healthy building has a direct benefit to the residents, and therefore you can sell that basically, you can meet the demand in the market and sell it for more or sell it faster. MIT actually just came out with a study that developments that have a healthy building certification can command a lease of between 4.4 and 7% more. So that's a very direct financial benefit that we can point to. So I think it's wrapping it up and branding it and packaging it in a way that we get what we want, but we demonstrate that they're getting what they want as well. But again, it's understanding the mechanisms, like understanding the motivations of the real estate developers, and then ensuring that we are directly answering kind of where they're going on their underwriting, for instance.
I think One thing I'd add to your point about, or question about how do you make the case that these benefits are impactful. I think for most of the investments or upgrades we think about from a sustainability and resiliency perspective, in the long term, sometimes in the long term, they do reap really important returns, but oftentimes it's in a time scale that feels inaccessible if it's a developer that's like building something and trying to sell it quickly. And so that I bring up as just a challenge. Sometimes the time scale of the return versus the time scale of the development that's happening. And then another thing I'll bring into this conversation from a city perspective is that a lot of the grant programs that we have access to on the federal level, for resiliency projects specifically, they have these cost benefit analysis components, but oftentimes the ways that we're required to go through that process are really restrictive. And so what that means is that if you're trying to develop a project that has a more, holistic approach to resilience, if you're trying to do things that have other features, if you can't quantify specifically, like, what this impact is, it oftentimes means that it has to go off the table in terms of access to funding. And so a big thing that the city has been doing has been trying to advocate to the federal government that cost benefit analysis processes just writ large incorporate more things like the health benefits to certain investments, or thinking about things like social cohesion, or trying to quantify that and why that is then a huge cost benefit. And it's hard, but I do think that we do have research to pull from to sort of make that case. But there's sort of still the structural things on the federal level that we have to change in terms of just how money gets to cities when they're trying to do these types of projects.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm also at NYU, and I'm taking a class called Urban Food Security, and we read a chapter from Julie Guthman's book called Weighing In on Obesity, and it talks a lot about, like, there's a specific chapter called Does Your Neighborhood Make You Fat? And it's just talking about how the built environment affects access, like both physical and economic, to food. And something that was like really discouraging to me from the chapter, because I'm super like advocate for green spaces and all these beautiful things. But something that like the author said was when they invested in like green spaces and community farms, what happened sometimes was that prices went up, and so like people were displaced. And like I think that's something that people always say. I don't want to be like, so how do we prevent that? But like, how can we make this part of the conversation so that the benefits help the people who are currently there, like as you were saying, building with and not for. Like whoever wants to answer, I'd be really curious to know how we can make cities more restorative without like having unintended negative consequences for the people already there.
Very good question. And you're referring to gentrification and the debate around green space. And that has affected development in Charlottesville, for sure. There's been a resistance to, let's say, planting street trees for fear of that argument. For me personally, I think access to green space is a fundamental right, and everybody should have access to it. How we handle the gentrification issue is by, I think, policy and controls and legislation that prevent, let's say, rents going up in an area. It needs governance to make sure that those things don't happen. But I don't think it's an argument for not providing high quality green space in poor communities. That's my view.
Yeah, I would have said exactly the same, right? It's really about displacement. That's the issue, right? The issue isn't kind of investing in a neighborhood. The issue is when an investment in a neighborhood causes displacement of the existing population. And so that's a policy issue. You have to be able to, right? You have to be able to put your hand on the scale of development, which we do all the time, by the way. So the idea that we don't create kind of like all sorts of different, mechanisms in order to control where money goes, we do it already. So you have to put in policies that allow for investment. I would absolutely agree that it is a fundamental right to be in a well-maintained neighborhood, that you have access to well-maintained green space, because actually poorly maintained green space is going to have a greater negative impact on trust than no green space at all. So you have to maintain your green space. You can't let it deteriorate. But we can't use this as a reason not to do it. I'm actually surprised that it's taken this long for gentrification to come up, because it's usually the first thing. And we've worked in communities that have refused to have an investment in their park for fear of it then triggering, a cycle of displacement around the park, because it does increase the value of the real estate, and you can quantify the value increase in that real estate. So it is putting more pressure on that real estate. Like, these are all things that we know and can quantify. But it's not a reason not to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I'd add, in addition to the housing rights protections and making sure that people aren't experiencing pressure of displacement, is also making sure that the green space that is being designed speaks to the community and speaks to what the community actually wants. Because you could build a really pretty park or really pretty space, but if the programming doesn't speak to the needs of the surrounding community, they'll think like, who is this for? This is not for me. This is for whoever's going to move into this neighborhood when I leave. And then B, it's not going to be used or not going to be seen as a community asset. So, I think about, we have many parks. They don't all function the same. They don't have the same programming. And I think that's a function of the neighborhoods that they're in. From everything from like the big parks to the pocket parks to even thinking about our urban farms. I always think about East New York farms and the way that they, some of the farming also speaks to the immigrant communities that are in East New York, but always making sure that the design is really speaking to what folks in the surrounding neighborhood that are gonna use that space want, and making sure that they have the space to sort of shape the spaces as they see fit.
Yeah, just like one quick point on that. It's like, while you're also making design moves that speak to the community that's immediately adjacent to the park, also do not put design elements in there that actively speak to people who live outside of the neighborhood, meaning like maybe restraint on blockbuster attractions, right? That kind of get people encouraged, like jump into a car or get on a subway train and cross like 3 boroughs to come to this park, right? That I think is also, that is something that sits maybe within the realm of design exclusively, that could be, if it's more considered and thought about, a way to fight against the kind of green gentrification that we're talking about.
I mean, I must say, from our vantage point, that COVID has really changed the narrative. So before COVID, again, on a weekly basis, daily basis, we were having to explain what public health is as compared to individual health. Because when people think of health, they're like, oh, our building promotes health, we do flu shots. And it's like, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about actually at all. And so we were having to explain public health and how really kind of the health of everybody affects the community at large. And I do think now that there's a much greater understanding between all of us, right, that we are interdependent, right? We are social creatures who are interdependent, and the health of one affects all of us. And I do think that with a global pandemic, that has really been brought home to us, right? It's not good enough for me, myself, to be healthy. I need my whole community to be healthy in order for me to be healthy, both physically and my mental health, actually, and trust and so on. So I do think that the argument that we need to make around the greater good is much easier to make now, that investing in a community is about the whole community, right? And it's not about individuals. So that for me is also a big leap forward that we've made, in that everybody now, I think, has a better understanding of why it matters, whomever you are, about the health of your neighbor and the health of your neighbor's neighbor and so on. Let's hope so, right? I'm a born optimist, but long may it live.
So I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I was like, everyone's raising their hand. Okay. I had kind of maybe it's a little bit of an oddball question, I think, related to what we've been talking about, but I was really struck by what you just said, actually, about the relationship between mental health and our connection to our neighbors. And I noticed when we were looking through the principles in the book, you talk about a number of things, but I think the underlying assumption, right, is that there's people, and we're in a city, and there's people in a city. And I'm curious, we live in a society in a time where there's so much distrust of between suburbs and cities, and obviously that's kind of a larger issue we could talk all night about. But I guess my question is, could you speak a little bit about the role of people in relationships and mental health, and how could these principles start to be applied to areas that are suburban also, that may already have trees or green space or whatever, but they don't have the connection to people that kind of like is knitting all of this together?
Big question. And in short, do I have an answer to it? Not don't. But we talk in design about human-centered design, understanding people's needs through processes like design thinking. We have a design thinker here. Being empathetic and building from the principle of empathy. And I don't think we have enough empathy in our communities currently. We also know that certain attributes of environments can generate empathy and altruism. And we're back to green space because it is one of those attributes that is linked with altruism and trust and a sense of belonging and of community. So embedding human-centered design principles, you'd think it would be obvious, but it's not. I'm in a school of architecture that's trying to do that through nurturing design thinking as a process, but it's not prevalent in all schools of architecture. I'm thinking of the AA perhaps in London, which is a very conceptually, theoretically driven architecture school where the idea of human-centered design is possibly quite low on their list. I teach architecture students environmental psychology. Those that I teach, those two here at the front and one at the back, had their eyes opened, I think that's fair to say, by the idea that how we interact with our world has a huge impact on our health. But it's not the prevalent view in schools of architecture, I have to tell you. I think I'm the only environmental psychologist in a school of architecture in the US, is what I've been told. So embedding those principles in those people who are designing for our environment is one step forward. Anybody else want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we talk about all the time is that every environment is impacting your health, whether the person who designed it knows it or not, right? That it is. So the fact that I walked here is because it's a human scale, there's proximity to transportation. I felt safe walking down the street. And I was getting all of those cues because of the larger urban design and the kind of the details as well. And so suburban or rural environments are affecting the health of the people who live there, even if they don't know it, even if the people who designed it don't know it. So I think it's also a matter of like bringing the research to the fore and saying, that actually you're living in an obesogenic environment, to go back to obesity, because if you're going from your house to your car with 5 steps, driving to your office, you're also not seeing anybody, you're not interacting with anyone, which is also adding to your social isolation and increased levels of anxiety, increased levels of stress, as well as an increased risk of obesity because you're sedentary for longer periods. And all of this is based on research, right? This isn't my opinion of the suburbs compared to an urban environment. I think that a New Yorker compared to their suburban socio-equivalent is 7 pounds lighter than their than an equivalent. And that's not because we're like, making better choices, right? It's because our built environment is giving us access and changing our behavior. So our behavior is directly related to the environments that we live in. So if you're living in a car-centric environment, you aren't necessarily going to interact with someone because you aren't walking to the shop. And so it's really important to understand that there may be benefits to that, but there are also quantifiable impacts on health as well. So we've built environments around cars for the last 50 years and not around people. it would be great if we could reverse that trend.
I think that there also might be an opportunity for this type of framework to really add to the nationwide conversations happening around affordable housing, particularly in places that are not as dense as New York City, but where housing is desperately needed. So if we're, there are many older suburbs that are in fact quite walkable, have sidewalks, and I think that the integration of more of these elements is quite possible, but B, in places where we know that there's a housing crisis and we're trying to look for opportunities to build more housing, these types of principles can also help in shaping that bigger picture of how how we basically make it possible for, some of these suburbs to be retrofitted to meet the need, create new opportunities for housing, but also done in such a scale that sort of speaks to all of the points that, Jenny so clearly laid out in the book.
And if I may just come back to the economic argument that if the people funding those housing developments and the rejuvenation of that housing are requiring metrics around health as part of their underwriting criteria, you don't even need to make the argument to the real estate developer because they're going to have to do it because they're getting their money from Fannie or they're getting their money from a pension plan or they're getting their money from PGIM, Prudential, or whatever. So if they have already adopted principles that are these principles because they care about their environmental, social, and governance metrics, which are all the rage right now in investment, that's kind of how you ensure that developments are following principles that are based on the evidence base, because they know, or we tell them, that those communities are more likely to be stable, that they're going to retain their value in a downward economic cycle, etc. So, this is where you have to go back to how are decisions made around how our suburbs are developed, right? There's a reason that they look like they do, and we need to understand what the reasons were, where the decisions were made, and what are the mechanisms by which we can change it at scale, right? Because we're not interested in one or two projects, right? That's not what any of us are talking about.
Can I add one thing to this conversation? I think that we also, for right now, since a lot of our area are the suburbs, these elements naturally draw people to them. And so if we can design some of these elements, like maybe just in a park space where you have water and you have little playful moments or moments of exploration, people then start gathering in those moments and then can create almost like so maybe they don't live nearby, but they're at least bringing people together in a community to then start to experience the things that we experience in a city of getting people walking or getting people to, play or connect with people they usually wouldn't, or that sort of thing. So I think that though they work better in a city in the sense of like we walk places and that sort of thing, I don't think it's like they can't be implemented in the suburbs. And I actually think they can start to create these moments of connection that maybe you do drive to, but then once you're there, you're immersing in these, you're getting these elements that we get in cities.
I think this might be our last question.
Thanks, Andrew. I wanted to add another facet to the green space and the displacement conversation. And this is playing out nearby where there's a piece of public property, well, it's called public place, it's not actually public property, but it's going to be developed as part of the Gowanus rezoning. And it's not going to have any market rate housing on it. It's going to all be affordable senior supported housing. It's a good project. And there's a pretty large constituency of the neighborhood around here who are fighting for a park and advocating for more green space. And what was interesting about it, it took me a while to get my head around it, some others, but this was a different form of displacement. Because you're now, by virtue of the fact that they didn't want the project there, they were advocating for more green space because of all the obvious benefits of green space, but they were displacing the future for an integrated community. And this goes back to your point, Daphne, about who's your audience and who you're talking to. And so I love everything I'm hearing, but there are these sort of nuances in how you negotiate through these things and being aware of what the hidden agendas are sometimes that may be on the surface very positive things, but have actually sort of darker, reasoning behind them because it's a form of just making sure that something doesn't happen that it serves the greater good.
Yeah.
That's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say, I totally agree. Like when we talk to, especially to affordable housing developers, because they're like, we can't do this, and we can't do this, right? With their very limited budgets, highly regulated, et cetera. It's like having housing at all, safe and secure housing, has the greatest impact on health. Everything we're talking about is beneficial on top of that. But just having housing, stable, secure housing, is going to have the greatest impact on people's overall health, quality of life, educational outcomes. So, you know, any kind of housing is better than, almost any kind of housing is better than no housing, right? So I mean, we keep touching on the housing crisis because the housing crisis is also a health crisis and it's a mental health crisis. So having housing is, you know, number one priority. Daphne, you want to add to the housing, the call for housing? All our commercial space is going to be housing soon anyway, isn't it? From every article I've read.
I mean, I think I'd echo what you're saying, that even in thinking about this framework, it's hard to access it if your basic needs aren't met. So again, like that goes back to thinking about housing, that goes back to like the basic needs that people need to exist anywhere. So I think the point you made about the future displacement or the Trojan horse that, you know, is sometimes developed, that, I mean, that's a big one. I think it also speaks to having, again, like elected officials that are able to see that bigger picture of, you know, yes, open space is critical in neighborhoods. And also we are in a housing crisis and we have to think about opportunities to create housing in a way that's also thinking about creating housing in all types of neighborhoods, not just, you know, low-income neighborhoods, and thinking about how do we, you know, integrate neighborhoods. So, I mean, that's not a response, that's just more of a thought, because like that's a big one. But I think it also just speaks to there needing to be this almost like a citywide, like fair share thinking when it comes to these types of things, like whether it's housing, whether it's where we cite things, like having this citywide view on things.
Yeah, we need to set collective priorities around growth and change in neighborhoods so that we're not forcing these false choices, right? Between like the greening of a neighborhood or housing, but there should be a ranking of like what neighborhoods need in order to be healthy, successful, prosperous places, so that the kind of, you know, the weaponizing of change doesn't really happen. We don't really have time for more questions. Like something I do wonder about is like coalition building within neighborhoods, because the point that Dave is talking about is really like a really insidious form of NIMBYism, right? Where there's some people who like bought into a neighborhood years ago, like their equity is secure, and they really don't need growth. They don't need more housing. They don't need more people, right? They just want more parks, and that's kind of it, right? And they're making this claim or this stake on a neighborhood that really comes at the expense of so many other people, future generations. And there just needs to be one leadership from the top to check that impulse. But then also among the people who like either live in a neighborhood and they want to see like more growth and change other than just greening and beautification, some way for them to connect with folks who don't live in that neighborhood yet, but also need those changes to occur.
I was just going to add one comment. It's not choosing one or the other. It's like rather we can have public housing, and the roof is a usable space. It can have, you know, public access restricted, so you can have both. Right? It's not like choosing one or the other. It's just like the lack of imagination, I would say.
Yeah, it's like the lack of imagination and also like calling people out on their BS. Right, when like the issue is not their failure to see how these two things come together, but they just do not want one and they only want the other.
Yeah, in my neighborhood, Fort Greene, not so far away, the local community managed to restrict the height of a building using all kinds of, you know, arguments. But those extra 2 floors would have been totally for affordable housing units only. So I don't really think it was the height that they were fighting, if I was being honest. Yeah, In fact, it wasn't the height. My husband actually had to be removed from the meeting because he started to express that strongly.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to leave the conversation on that note. That was good. Maybe to wrap up, yeah, can we?
Can I bring in some speculative fiction, science fiction? Since
Yes,
we talked about that.
yes, absolutely.
So, I mean, I think that I'm going back to the example that you mentioned because, Brian, because I think there's almost an exercise, you know, in a lot of the work that we do around climate resilience, we're really mandated and oriented to think about the impacts of climate change, like from the time scale of like 50 years, 100 years, what have you. And I think that a similar exercise could be done when we think about development and how we choose to develop and what it means if we choose if we lack imagination and if we do an either or approach, what it means if we choose like this site to be X versus this site to be, you know, a place that has affordable housing or other, you know, critical pieces of infrastructure. There's like I don't know, like a time scale or a future thing where it could actually be interesting to see, like, depending on what door you choose, like what are those implications decades down the line?
Yeah, the kind of scenario planning.
Yeah.
Yes, we're out in San Francisco, everybody's think tank did a project like that a few years ago, just like mapping out 4 potential futures for the Bay Area.
Right.
Right.
You could use Sin City for it or something, right?
Yeah.
To get a really quick response.
Yeah, or like
Minecraft, yeah.
Yeah, you're the young people of Minecraft.
We're not the young.
You're not, but we're the old.
Hardly.
No, I'm not having this conversation.
Again, downer note.
It's cheese.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay, here's my up note concluding. First of all, Andrew, awesome job moderating. Thank you for doing that. I was telling Andrew, so nice to not be the one doing that and to have someone else do it. I want to thank our panelists. You three, and our excellent questions give me such a sense of hope about if people are grappling. These are very complex systems that we're talking about, and there are many, many levers that result in things that we can't necessarily anticipate, or we might anticipate them, but then the return and the investment are untethered, right? And that's a problem. And all of you are grappling with that in a very meaningful and complex way, and that gives me so much hope for what can happen next, especially in this moment when barriers are a little lower than they've been for a while, right? And change can happen. So that's the note I want to end on. And also just to thank you all. I mentioned earlier that this was our first event here, and we were all like, how are we doing this? Are people going to show up? So I'm excited that you all did, and that you brought your kind of game spirit to it and asked the questions, and more to come. So stick around, have some wine, have some cheese, and thank you for coming, and thank you for being on our panel.
Yeah, so folks want to grab some more wine, cheese, bread.
Yeah, no. I love
bread.